The train screeched in a dry creek just past noon, spitting steam and grit into the July air. Dust curled like ghosts between wagon wheels and porch posts, and above it all loomed the sun, swollen and merciless. Townsfolk lined the edge of the platform like crows on a fence, their Sunday-best hats clutched against the heat, their eyes narrowed toward the promise stepping off the train. Boaz Calder stood at the far end of the station, boots planted like rooted timber, a bouquet of wildflowers dampening in his trembling hand. His vest strained against his chest, and sweat darkened the band of his hat. He had polished his boots for this, washed behind his ears, rehearsed what he might say if her smile was crooked, if her voice trembled. What he hadn't prepared for was the way silence could cut deeper than words. She stepped down, tall, fine-boned, with eyes that scanned him from hat to heel in a single flick of dismissal. She didn't approach, just stood on the gravel and tilted her chin. "You didn't mention your size," she murmured just loud enough for a half-dozen ears to catch. A murmur rippled down the platform. Boaz removed his hat. "Ma'am," he began, voice thick with heat and shame. "I'll find my own arrangements," she said, turning sharply, skirts swishing like a curtain, closing on a play that never began. The bouquet drooped in his hand. He didn't follow, didn't plead. He stood still, as if stillness could keep the embarrassment from spreading across his wide chest. Around him, whispers rustled like dry grass. Sadie Ruth Callahan lowered her fan just enough to smirk. Boaz bowed his head and slowly walked toward the waiting area, his boots scuffing along the boards. Dust clung to his trousers like memory. Then a smaller voice broke through the murmurs. "High and curious. Southern. Are you my daddy?" He turned. A little girl, maybe 4, stood 2 steps behind him, looking up with wide brown eyes and a fistful of fabric from her mother's skirt clutched in one hand. She had wild curls and a face that wore no shame. "Just a question." Boaz blinked, caught somewhere between startled and stunned. The girl tilted her head. Behind her stood a woman, dust-covered, tired, younger than he expected, but with the same shape to her cheekbones as the woman who had just walked away. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly. "She gets confused. Been a long trip. She didn't mean anything by it." Boaz looked at the girl again. "No harm," he said gently, lowering to one knee. "No, sweetheart. I ain't your daddy." The girl furrowed her brow. "You look like one." That stirred a flicker in him, half amusement, half something deeper. He rose and glanced at the mother, who shifted under his gaze. "I'm Esme Lindley," she said, lifting her chin in defiance of her exhaustion. "My sister was the bride." He nodded once. "Didn't know she had kin coming." "She didn't," Esme replied. "She changed her mind, but didn't tell me until I was already halfway here." Boaz exhaled slowly. "That's so. I thought I could find work. Something honest. But folks already look at me like I crawled out of sin and brought it with me." Her voice faltered. "Most won't even rent a room to a woman with a child and no ring." Her shoulders squared, but her eyes, those betrayed the weight, the fatigue, the quiet unraveling. "I ain't a skin for charity," she said. He looked from her to the child, then back again. The girl had sat down cross-legged on the platform, busy drawing something in the dust with her finger. Boaz hesitated. The town was still watching, judging, but his cabin stood empty on 100 acres, and he had more bread than mouths to feed. "I got a place up north," he said finally. "Ain't fancy, but it's clean, if you need rest." Her eyebrows lifted. "Just like that." He scratched his neck, sheepish. "I figure what a person needs and what they deserve don't always line up. But either way, I got room." Esme hesitated. "One night. We'll be gone in the morning." He nodded. "Start with 1. The girl looked up. "Can I ride a horse?" Boaz allowed the hint of a smile. "We'll see." They walked together past the town's judgment, past Marshall Riker's narrowed gaze and Sadie Ruth's flapping fan. Every pair of eyes followed the 3 of them. An abandoned man, a fallen woman, and a child who asked too much. By the time they reached the hitched wagon, the sun had lowered just enough to burn gold along the rooftops. Boaz helped Esme onto the seat without touching her more than needed. The child scrambled up on her own and reached instinctively for Boaz's hand. He gave it. They rode in silence, The road to his ranch lined with willow and wind. The wagon creaked, birds flitted from fence post to fence post, and the air grew cooler. Esme watched the horizon. She's never had a man show kindness. She's young. She watches everything. Even the way I flinch when someone raises their voice. Even when I don't want her to. Boaz kept his eyes ahead. Maybe she's just watching for something good. Esme turned away, biting her lip. They reached the ranch house as dusk dipped the sky in lavender. The porch sagged but stood firm. A lantern flickered in the window like a held breath. Boaz stepped down and offered a hand. She took it this time. Her skin was cold despite the heat. Inside, Esme marveled at the order. Everything neat, quiet, warm. Mabel wandered like a kitten, pausing to look at a carved wooden horse on the mantel. Boaz stoked the fire and set a pot of beans to warming. He said little, just watched the woman sit at his kitchen table like she was waiting for someone to tell her to leave. Later, as twilight deepened, Mabel fell asleep curled in a chair with her thumb in her mouth. Esme rose to lift her, but staggered with fatigue. Boaz caught the girl before she slipped and carried her to the back room, laying her gently on the spare cot. Esme followed, arms folded, eyes glassy. "I'll sleep on the floor," she said. Boaz handed her a quilt. "Ain't no one sleeping on the floor under my roof. I'll take the barn." She looked at him then, really looked, and her mouth opened like she might protest, but all she said was, "Thank you." Boaz nodded, stepped out into the dusk, and paused by the porch post as the last light faded. Behind him, Esme lingered in the doorway, arms around herself, watching him disappear into the dark like a man who never expected anything back from the world. She whispered to herself, that little girl might have been wrong, but in the quiet that followed, she wasn't so sure. Morning drifted in like a hymn, soft, golden, hesitant. Dew clung to the porch rails, and the ranch wore its silence like a comfort. From the barn, Boaz watched the first smoke curl up from his chimney, meaning Esme was already at the stove. He hadn't slept much. The straw had been stiff, but it wasn't that. Something in him had shifted, like an old creek remembering how to carry water again. Inside, Esme stood barefoot on the worn kitchen floor, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied back in a makeshift ribbon. The smell of eggs and cornmeal mingled with the hush of the morning. She moved like she'd lived there longer than a night, as if quiet labor made her invisible or safe. Mabel sat on the counter, kicking her heels and humming to herself. Boaz stepped in slow, wiping his hands on a rag. "Smells good." Esme glanced up, startled, then nodded. "Didn't think you'd want to cook after lending out your bed and barn." He pulled out a chair. "Would have made coffee if I'd known breakfast came with the trade." She allowed a small smile, quick and private. "Mabel wakes early. She's loud about it." He looked at the child, who beamed at him and held up a crude drawing of a horse and 3 stick figures, all holding hands. "That me in the middle?" he asked. "That's Daddy," Mabel said, then added quickly, "or pretend Daddy, just for the picture." Esme froze, spatula still in hand, but Boaz only nodded and accepted the paper like it was scripture. They ate in the hush of early light, spoons clinking softly. No one mentioned the town, or how long they might stay. But when Esme reached for the skillet and Boaz reached too, their hands touched and didn't flinch. Later that morning, Marshal Glenn Riker rode up the path with his hat low and a face already full of questions. Boaz stepped out to meet him halfway, his shoulders wide with purpose. "Got talk in town," the marshal said, dismounting. "Sadie Ruth says you picked up a woman off the platform like a stray pup." Boaz crossed his arms. "She needed shelter, so I gave it." Riker studied the ranch behind him. "Town don't like loose threads, Boaz. And you know how folks get when their stories don't end tidy. They can find new stories to tell," Boaz muttered. The marshal chewed his lip. "Just make sure you know what you're bringing into your house. Women like her, they've been hurt by more than just men." Boaz's jaw worked. Then he looked out at Esme and Mabel in the garden bed near the porch, planting seeds like they might still believe in spring. "I do know," he said, voice low. "That's why they're staying." Riker studied him a beat longer, then tipped his hat and mounted up. "You always were too kind for your own good, Bo." Boaz watched the dust trail vanish down the road. then turned back toward the house. Inside, Esme knelt with dirt on her skirt, pressing marigold seeds into the soil. Mabel danced around her with a watering can that leaked more than it poured. They belonged in that moment, quiet, busy, unnoticed. And Boaz realized then that he didn't just want to protect them. He wanted them to stay. But that night, the fever came. It started with a cough, small, shallow, and then a cry sharp enough to shake the rafters. Boaz found Mabel curled and burning on the cot, her face slick with sweat, her limbs jerking with chills. Esme hovered above her, helpless and panicked, trying to bring down the heat with damp cloths and whispered prayers. "She was fine this morning," Esme kept saying. "She was fine." Boaz touched the child's forehead and felt the fire eating her up from the inside. No time to wait. No doctor would come this far out night. "I'm going," he said. "You can't." Esme's voice cracked. But he was already moving, hitching the horse, strapping on boots, wrapping his coat tight. He rode fast and hard into the dark, the wind clawing his face, dust stinging his eyes. Dry Creek was a blur, the doctor's shuttered office a blurrier one. He banged on the back door until the man woke, grumbled, cursed, and finally handed over a tin of powdered medicine and a sack of clean linens. Boaz didn't stop to explain, just paid what coin he had and rode back faster, the moon high and brittle above him. When he returned, Esme was on the floor, holding Mabel like she could keep the fever away by sheer will. Her eyes lifted when she saw him, wide and wild. He knelt, mixing the medicine with water, his thick hands surprisingly careful. Mabel whimpered but swallowed. They waited. Esme sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She was shaking, but not from cold. "I should have never brought her into this," she whispered. "I've failed her too many times." "You didn't fail her," Boaz said, his voice like gravel and honey. "You loved her enough to keep going. That counts for more than folks know." The fever broke by dawn. Mabel's breath steadied. Her skin cooled. Esme cried then, not loud, but deep, like something breaking free from under a year of sorrow. Boaz sat nearby, not touching her, not saying a word. Just there. When light crept through the window, Esme found him asleep in the rocking chair, arms crossed, boots still on. She covered him with the quilt from his own bed. That morning, he woke to the smell of music. Soft piano chords, slow and halting, drifted from the parlor. Esme sat at the old upright, fingers dancing over keys dulled by years of dust. Mabel leaned against her hip, humming nonsense. Boaz stood in the hallway, unmoving, as the sound filled the space like water in a dry basin. He hadn't heard that piano in 9 years. Not since his mother's funeral. Not since silence had seemed safer than song. He took one step closer. The floor creaked. Esme looked up at him, hands still hovering over the keys. She didn't smile this time. She just said, "We'd stay if you asked us." And Boaz, a man who'd spent half his life being left, stood at the edge of his own house and realized, for once, he was the one who could choose. Outside, Sadie Ruth passed by in her wagon, slowed to a crawl, and stared at the scene inside. Man, woman, child, and music. But for once she said nothing. And in the quiet, Boaz stepped forward, as if into a life that had been waiting on him all along.